Deep within the woods, miles from any permanent civilization, a place known only to campers, fishermen, hikers, and bears, lived a tiny little caterpillar. Unlike most yellow and black varieties that inhabited the area, this tiny little fellow shone bright with highlight of pink and green, and remained well hidden and invisible to the people that enjoyed the ambience of his woodland home. The tiny caterpillar enjoyed his solitude and privacy, but was fascinated by the strange gatherings that would sometimes take place near his home. Strange, wonderful creatures, tall, colorful things walking on two legs, carrying glowing sticks with two arms, would sometimes convene within the woods and dance frenetically around each other. Loud drums would beat steadily from huge black boxes that the creatures brought, along with things he could only assume were gods, dancing beside spinning discs of power, seemingly controlling the heavy beat that echoed through the woods. Their natural body armor was a beautiful sight. They were wrapped with thick body armor that showed off every color of the rainbow, which was a wise decision, considering how many predators existed in the surrounding mountains. The caterpillar loved these beings and watched over them every chance he had. He would readily give his life to protect their safety, as he felt a great importance over their activities in this world. One day, as he awoke from his cozy 3-day nap, the tiny caterpillar looked around his woods and saw something very peculiar. There were 8 large domes gathered together where he normally took his midnight stroll. How strange! He thought, inching himself down the tree and along the ground to get a better look. Soon, sitting at the base of one of the strange shapes, he made the fantastic conclusion these were cocoons. Not just any cocoons, huge cocoons. No doubt, this was where the beings spun their own cocoons, and transformed into the magnificent creatures that danced at the gatherings. He squeezed his way inside through a tiny hole, and adventured within unknown lands. Once inside, the pink caterpillar was shocked. This was like no cocoon he had ever seen before. There was entirely too much space, the walls were spun far too thin to keep out any sort of predator, and it was just as cold inside as it was out. His tsks and other varied sounds of disappointment quickly turned to alarm as he saw an enormous pink figure laying within a half-open sack, its entire upper body exposed to the elements. The tiny caterpillar panicked and gave a tiny shriek of horror, for he had stumbled upon one of the beings, although a being unlike any he had seen before. Whereas the beings at the gatherings had bright, distinctive patterned armor and shells, this one was completely pale, save a tiny mat of shaggy armor on top his head. Immediately, the caterpillar realized what had happened. This was not a being, but a being's larva, only halfway finished his cocoon, left alone out in the elements to be eaten by a horrible, greedy predator. The tiny caterpillar had never seen a being's larva before, and the sight of a dying, vulnerable one filled his heart with a sadness he had never felt before. Quickly crawling closer to the being's mouth, the caterpillar listened for any evidence of wind passing through its face. After a few tense moments, the slightest gasp came from within its body, and excitement and hope filled its tiny soul. There was still time for this larva to become one with its society, and join the gatherings when they returned to the woods. He would have to hurry, as time was short. This was finally his chance to prove to the universe how much he cared for these beings. He had lived his life, enjoyed many a millennia observing the world, and was now ready to sacrifice himself for one last noble deed, something so selfless that he would earn his place with his great ancestors in the wormy beyond. The caterpillar was host to an incredible fountain of power, but instead of moving mountains or parting oceans, he wanted to give this poor being something special, something only for it to enjoy. Something that would last forever. With no time to waste, he set himself upon the unconscious larva, and shot a quick blast of silk on the top of his head, covering the small amount of armor it had grown, instantly reinforcing it. He focused his energy, and began moving down the being's chest, past the half-opened cocoon, moving faster and faster as he did so. Silk began shooting out of the pink caterpillar at an incredible rate, with the tiny soul flipping and zipping around, forcing himself underneath the half-cocooned being, wrapping the silk as tight as possible. The pink caterpillar could feel his energy quickly draining and knew the ultimate sacrifice was near. Still, he pressed on, becoming a pink blur of silk, focused on only one thing: saving the being. In only a matter of minutes, the pink caterpillar had sealed the exposed larva completely within his warm, protective silk, protected from the harsh environment surrounding them within the woods. The caterpillar stood and raised many of its tiny legs, waving them to and fro, funneling more of its life force to the newly made cocoon. The metamorphosis had begun, and quickly began to accelerate, which would allow the being's true form to hatch within hours instead of weeks, as there was no time to waste in getting it free from the potentially dangerous woods, and back to a gathering where it belonged. Something was slightly amiss with this larva. It seemed different than the being he had seen at the gatherings. Its body was oddly shaped compared to what it remembered, sticking out in all the wrong places. The poor thing was deformed. No matter, thought the caterpillar, it's nothing I can't fix. With that, a firm goo filled the cocoon, and began to twist and reshape itself to the caterpillar's whim. The larva had its numerous flaws and differences hidden by the liquid armor, which formed itself according to the features favored by the caterpillar over his many years of visiting the gatherings. The goo within the cocoon made its way to the larva's face, melting itself into place, reforming based on various memories from the caterpillar, turning into something special that will truly make this fantastic being fit in with the others, no matter what it was born like. No one would ever know the secret contained underneath this special material. After the larva was coated in the first layer of primordial goo, the caterpillar began to imbue his knowledge of hundreds of gatherings into the magically spun cocoon, which immediately began to form new material onto the young larva, its feet and body covered with the first frameworks of its new home. He concentrated and melded his memories together, recalling his favorite colorful shells and armor the beings had worn while dancing all through the night, then incorporating them into the ultimate armored shell for the sleeping larva to inhabit. Focusing on the memory of these shells, he set a change upon the larva that would cover him with its own special armor to inhabit an impervious home that contained the caterpillar's ancient powers, and would withstand any sort earthly attack. He smiled as he sensed the different pieces of armor forming from the goo within, and settling into its final shape. The caterpillar wanted to assure the being that its impervious armor was the only protection it would ever need, but he knew he wouldn't live long enough to see the larva hatch and teach him about it. The young being was bound to feel threatened in its new environment, and not understand the power it's surrounded and protected by. Focusing his power again, the caterpillar imbued the being's armor with a very unique power, one that no other being would ever have, one that would reveal itself at the right time, when the being feels threatened and decides to protect itself with a laughably inferior shell or armor. The power would unleash itself then, and only then, and prove that the shell the being inhabits is all it will ever need. With his final dying motion, the caterpillar himself transformed into a ball of pink light, and floated within the cocoon, giving the tent a beautiful glow. This being was to be his child, his legacy to the world, an eternal being that would lead all beings into a new, golden age of gatherings all around the world. With that, the caterpillar's spirit fizzled out, and left existence forever. Waking with a start, Ted instantly knew that something was amiss in his tent. Somehow in the pitch-black confines of his tent, he could tell something was different. His body felt numb, his legs were cold, and he had the taste of cotton candy all over his lips. Wait, candy? He didn't bring any candy on this trip, neither did any of his friends. This was a hot dog and burger trip. He wouldn't be caught dead eating kids' candy in front of his friends. He shivered and was met with the sudden realization that instead of being cozy in a nice warm blanket, he was lying on the floor of the tent. His sleeping bag was nowhere to be found. He grumbled and sat up, which hit him with a barrage of sensations that he wasn't quite ready for, nor would most likely never be ready for. First off, something was pinching his head, hard. There were 2 solid points on his scalp that felt like they were trying to pull his hair out, which was exacerbated by 2 very large and very heavy weights, something that swished and swung back and forth as he turned his head in the darkness. Not only that, his entire body felt bizarre and out of proportion. It felt like he was sleeping on a bunch of rocks all night. Soft rocks, ones that pushed his body around in awkward places. Rocks that seems to jiggle and follow him as he shuffled around, seated on the hard floor of the tent. His legs in particular felt incredibly smooth, yet very constricted. Did he wear long johns to bed? He couldn't remember. He did have a sheet twisted around his waist though, although he didn't remember bringing it. He twisted and pulled at it, but it was too tangled to stretch anywhere past his thighs. Trying to wiggle his toes, he found he could barely make them move, as his feet were cramped and packed into something heavy and big weight. He knew that he had taken his shoes off before getting into the tent. Reaching around in the darkness, he was beginning to sense that something was very, very wrong. Ted's brain hollered out inside his skull as his blind groping in the darkness landed his hands on his chest, which found themselves pressed against a heavy, round, soft, fluffy weight. His hands shot back to his sides as if they'd grabbed a handful of molten lead, sending the mound swaying heavily side to side. He carefully cupped both hands around these foreign bodies, breathing in quick breaths as panic and utter confusion courses through his brain, burying his hands further into the gelatinous bulge. What were these? What happened last night? Did I fall asleep first? Are the guys messing with me? What did they do? Whatever was wrapping itself around his chest, he definitely didn't want it there any longer. Grabbing both of the soft fluffy mounds, he quickly pulled as hard as he could, only to have them stretch from his chest and violently smack back, bouncing around within its fur confines like crazy. He grabbed again, mashing them around, trying to push whatever it was inside the fur lining out, but all parts of the material were stuck straight to his skin. As much as he smacked, pinched, and pulled on them, the only pain Ted felt was the pull of these things on his chest, meaning he hadn't grown tits in the middle of the night. Some prankster must have attached them to him, rather unwillingly. He couldn't take being in pitch-black tent anymore, and needed to take action now. In order to get in sort of visual bearing on the situation, Ted knew that he needed to find a flashlight. Right now. He let go of his chest and got onto his knees, which gave him a jolt as was the back of his thighs squished against something very large and soft, and Ted was suddenly filled with the sensation that he had sat on a reasonably large wild animal. He threw himself to the side of the tent, colliding with the thin walls, mashing against it with the heavy weight attached to his head, pulling and whipping themselves around the empty space as he did. He pushed blindly at his feet, again feeling the thick body of a furry woodland creature, albeit with much less panic and much more horror. Where he thought there might be a vengeful beaver or a huge vicious squirrel, there was actually a large thick tube of fur wrapped tightly around each of his feet. His hands sank into the soft landscape, and felt the bulk of them going all the way up to his calves. He had no idea what was happening, but he knew 2 things for sure: he was wearing huge fuzzy boots, and he was sporting a large pair of fuzzy breasts. As his hands left the boots, they continued up his legs, which seemed to be much less sensitive than they usually were when he wasn't wearing pants. He felt around his thighs, feeling as if they had been wrapped in something as well, something very thin, very smooth, very delicate. Ted was getting very afraid of the mental image he was gathering from all these tactical sensations. He started kicking the boots off, as he felt incredibly creeped out by the fuzzy beasts and didn't want them anywhere near his legs. He sunk his right sole into his left boot and pushed hard, only to have the boot completely resist his efforts. He grunted a number of silent obscenities as he begrudgingly wrapped both his hands around his right boot, getting the full sensation and experience of his furry new apparel, and gave a mighty pull, only to find the boot had been firmly attached to him. What the hell is going on with this thing? This is getting ridiculous, Ted thought. Whoever pulled this prank is going to pay. He snapped out of his attempt to free his feet and started feeling around the wall of the tent, exploring until his hands met the bare length of the zipper. A minor note of relief washed over him, and he quickly felt the zipper all the way to the floor, and quickly zipped open the exit to his pitch-black nightmare. His escape was short-lived, as something attached to his back quickly pressed against the roof of the tent, quickly sitting him back to the floor, the big fluff of his feet gently cushioning his backside. Feeling around his shoulders, his hands landed on a stiff sheet of fabric sticking straight out from his back. No, make that 2 sheets of fabric. He tried to yank them off in a fury, but was just as successful as he was with his boots. Not wanting to do any more explorations of his situation in pitch-black confines, he crawled as low as he could go, exiting the tent, the large contraption on his back swaying underneath the roof as he did so. Finally free of the tent, Ted stood up, feeling a fluffing of fabric all around his thighs, a jiggling that had slowed to a halt on his chest, the constant constriction around his head, which seemed to enjoy whipping his face with something long and soft whenever he moved his head too fast. He felt around the bedsheet he was tangled in, and immediately put it together. It was a skirt. Underneath the frilly piece of humiliation was a bizarre, swollen mass all over his ass and hips. He grabbed and rubbed it, and was immediately reminded of the weights now swinging from his chest. In the dim moonlight, a slight metallic glint revealed Dave's truck parked near the trees, leaving his body and everything else obscured by darkness. Not wanting to be in the situation for much longer, he quickened his pace through the dark campsite. His quick steps were suddenly slowed to a literal tiptoe. The sound of his big boots had kicked up enough gravel to stir someone in another tent. Who is? A drowsy voice murmured, followed by a loud rustling of a sleeping bag being turned over in a huff. All was quiet, minus the heavy heartbeat of a very confused young Ted, and soon it was apparent his disturbance didn't warrant an investigation. Moving again, this time much more carefully, Ted reached the truck and looked in the back, spotting the top of the flashlight and the small amount of moonlight available to him. He grabbed it, hesitated for a moment as he had no idea what he was about to see, set it down on the lip of the truck's box, and turned it on. The piercing light shot out and flooded the area with his shadow and a horde of pink and blue sparkles. Ted winced and squinted, his eyes familiar with the dark and a stranger to the light, and he turned his head away, seeing his shadow cast along the ground. He stared at the alien silhouette, focusing on the huge shadowy towers standing up from his head, the large bottom that had somehow grown overnight, and the 2 very large and very obvious wings sticking out from behind him. He turned back toward the light, and although his eyes soon adjusted to it, they would never adjust to what he saw. He put his hands to his mouth, trapping a scream that would inevitably bring a circle of laughing, pointing campers. Looking down at himself, he was met with his familiar fuzzy friend sticking out from his chest, a very obvious and large pair of breasts contained within a furry green top, covered in a sparkling glitter that sent tiny flecks of light around him as he moved. Looking down further, he saw a poofy skirt surrounding his waist and a white frilly froth of fabric peeking out from underneath. He lifted the skirt and grabbed around his crotch. His precious manhood was still there all right, but seemed to be covered by a thick, soft, rubbery material. He picked at it and felt around below, and gasped as his fingers ran across a narrow pair of holes, burrowing deep within the soft spheres of jelly that surrounded his torso. Whoever did this to him intended him to stay humiliated for a very long time. Since his new hip and ass wouldn't budge from his furious yanks, he'd have to sit to pee and poop, and that didn't sit well with him at all. And what was making his legs feel as strange as they did a ridiculous pair of yellow and green tights. Were those hearts? They certainly were, big green hearts all over the tights, like a radioactive raver leopard lurking in the yellow jungle. Pinching them revealed absolutely no give, which didn't surprise him at all. This was a pretty thorough job, and he was getting pissed. Since his breasts were difficult to look past, he had to bend way over to see what was grasping his feet, an absolutely ridiculous pair of pink fur bulges that swallowing his legs, complete with tiny bows on the toes and a constant feeling of their soft fur mashing against each other. The boots glittered and glinted in the artificial light as well, and were hugging his feet tight like there was no tomorrow. The analysis of his boots only took a fraction of a second, and it took yet another fraction for his outfit to interrupt his view as two big fluffs of hair fell into his vision, swinging around and licking against each other, coming to an eventual rest. He grabbed both of them in shock, staring madly at the thick pink and blue locks pouring out from the top of his head, long strands of tinsel stuck in the poofy volume of it all, making his head a glittering beacon for only the most dedicated candy ravers. Feeling around his head, he could tell each of them was locked in place by a ribbon or a bow. He picked and pulled at whatever it was, but it stuck fast to the tower of pink. Ted turned to the truck and pulled the large side mirror over to see his face, and he instantly wished he hadn't. Framed underneath a thick wall of pink bangs was the most heavily made-up face he'd ever seen. He held his hand to his lips, the big fur cuff around his wrist introducing itself by licking his bare chest as he did so. Leaning in closer, he got a good look at his thick blue eyeshadow, his glossy, plump pink lips, his huge black eyelashes that apparently grew quite a bit while he was out. He put a hand to his cheek, which was now home to a beautiful rosy glow amidst a field of porcelain skin. Some sort of incredibly thick foundation had set itself in place, the blush fading perfectly into it in all directions. His eyeshadow and lips had the honor of being covered in pretty glitter, which is what sparked Ted to begin trying to remove it from his face immediately. He licked his lips and was met with the oddest sensation. His lips tasted like pure sour candy. He paused, and wet his lips again, tasting the burst of candy, as if it was coming up from his pores. He licked his lips again, building up a solid coating of spit, hoping to dilute his lipstick somewhat with his saliva, then madly began rubbing his fur-cuffed wrists all around his mouth, and soon began rubbing the cuffs all over his entire face. After nearly giving his entire face rug burn, he peered into his reflection, only to see his perfect, flawless makeover perfectly intact. He froze in terror, knowing that only a second ago he had wiped his lips clean of any sort of gloss of candy residue, but he again could taste the sweet bite of candy on his lips once more. He picked at the eyelashes, and winced in pain as his eyelid clung onto it for dear life. Tears welled up in his eyes, realizing that someone had glued them in place, and he was now shaking with rage and fear. Once his tears had sufficiently welled up enough through a combination of facial pain and fear, he let go, watching a stream of tears run down his face, bringing absolutely no mascara, eyeliner, eyeshadow, or foundation along with it. When he saw the pretty pink wings sticking out from behind him, it was enough to convince him to stop looking in the mirror. Not knowing why or how he had been dressed like this, and finding everything on his body was firmly held in place by God knows what, his thoughts went from long-term freedom to short-term hiding. If everyone woke up in the morning and found him looking the way he did, there's no way he could ever live it down. For all he knew, one of the other campers had a hand in this, and were waiting with a video camera at the first sign of him discovering his horrific outfit, which would have originally been a scream of terror, if it wasn't for his initial adventure in the confusing dark abyss of his tent. As much as he loved laughing at people humiliating themselves on YouTube, he certainly did not want to be the internet's newest unwilling celebrity. Someone had sealed him into an incredibly feminine fairy raver outfit, and he had to find a way out of it, or at least a way to temporarily cover up his amazingly gaudy appearance. Ted grabbed the flashlight and began searching around the campsite for something to hide his outfit with, being incredibly careful not to hit any tent with a waking beam of light. It didn't take long before the flashlight revealed a hat, carelessly discarded near the fire pit, which was still sending tiny mocking wisps of smoke in his direction. Ted minced over in his outfit, his fairy clothes sending the sound of ruffling crinoline through the camp. Quickly snatching the hat from the ground, he held it up and began piling his big pigtails into the cap. He pushed the majority of his right pigtail in, and pulled hard on the hat to keep it down on his head. The hat bulged with the vast volume of the hair, and refused to cooperate with his attempt to hide it. He leaned forward, letting his twin pigtails fall into view, then gathered them at the bottom of the hat, packing as much hair in as he could, then pulling the entire mess on top of his head. His heart sank as the wad of hair had not only filled the cap, but had gathered into a large pink and blue pile underneath of it, making the hat look incredibly small on his big pink and blue hairdo. He would need a hat at least 5 times the size of it to fit his hairdo in. He let go of the pile as he pulled the hat off, his long sparkling hair fluffed and spun around his head, swinging around like a belly dancer on speed. Throwing the hat down in a huff, Ted turned his attention to the line of towels drying on the side of the truck. They had been used after all the guys had swam in the river, and were now coated with a lovely collection of river water, sweat, and sunscreen. Ted didn't care, as he now valued his privacy over hygiene, anything to cover up this mess he somehow landed in and was completely undeserving of. He grabbed a bunch of wet towels and again leaned forward, gathering his hair inside. He managed to fit both pigtails inside of a single large soggy towel, which he piled onto his head, quickly wrapping yet another towel around it to hold it in place. Hugging his face tight, the end of the towel was tucked beneath itself, wrapped around his neck, leaving him looking like a ninja wearing an oversized turban. A jacket had been thankfully discarded not far from him, a nice heavy item that had plenty of room for his new assets. As he threw it on, he glanced around the camp, the flashlight revealing various empty cans and discarded buns, and something amazing, a pair of jeans. All he needed to do was get a pair of jeans on, and a large enough pair of boots to hide the pink sparkle party happening on his legs. He zipped the coat up, and was greeted with a sudden tightness as the zipper hit the halfway point. He pulled harder, and again the zipper began to strain. The coat would have easily fit yesterday, but his breasts were now making things much more difficult. They were much too large to comfortably fit in the coat. He exhaled sharply, then pulled up the zipper as hard as he could, sending the tongs flying together, big bits of green fluff sticking through the joined metal teeth. Regret ran wild as Ted suddenly felt very claustrophobic. The heavy jelly mounds were now firmly compacted against him, making his chest incredibly squished and making it difficult to breathe, especially in such a panicked state. He pulled the zipper down, but it quickly became stuck once it hit the bits of fur that had been caught in it. He pulled again and again, with the zipper suddenly letting loose and unzipping halfway, sending his big fuzzy breasts swaying into the open free air. Looking like a drag queen raver hoochie with his breasts spilling out of his half-zipped coat, he yanked furiously to unzip the jacket, harder and harder, interrupted by a sudden ping. The zipper had snapped off, but the coat remained halfway zipped. He sighed a quivering, frustrated sigh, as he was now stuck with his breasts revealed to this world, a jiggling green mass, bouncing with even most idle of movements. He made his way to the towels once more and stopped the constant bouncing of his falsy friends by wrapping another towel around himself, now looking like a turban ninja pretending to be a vampire. Ted was confident that at least the towels would hold and keep his hair and makeup hidden. All he had to do now was hide his legs. He peeked through the narrow slit in his newly made towel headdress with his newly made over eyes, and set his sights on the discarded jeans. They looked big enough to pull over his ridiculous get-up, hiding his boots, tights, and skirt, which never seemed to stop rustling and swishing around his thighs, one of the many constant reminders of the situation he was trapped in. He slowly crept to where the jeans were resting, lifted them from the ground, and brought them back to the truck where no one would hear him fussing about. Holding the jeans low enough to get a leg in without tripping and stumbling, he stepped into them, finding his fluffy boots quickly plugging up the pant leg, the material bulging out like crazy. He pushed harder, gaining a small amount of ground, but still finding the boot stuck within the pant leg. Gritting his teeth, giving his head a shake, getting even more angry as his big pigtails swam around, he held the waist of the pants as hard as he could as he stomped his weight into the pant leg. Much to his surprise, the boot let out a large shump and quickly slammed down on the ground on the other side. For the first time that night, something seemed to be going Ted's way, which gave him the energy he needed to plow his other foot into the pants. After much grunting and more silent cursing, both the boots were crammed firmly in the jeans, and they were quickly pulled to his waist. His sparkling tutu skirt he was wearing found itself crammed inside the torso of the jeans, and Ted now had a glimmer of hope that he could get through this, humiliation-free. Once the skirt was within his jeans, giving the impression that he was wearing a large diaper, he buttoned the waist and gave the zipper a mighty pull, somehow locking the fluffy mess within the jeans with a loud zip. Breathing a sigh of relief, he now had one more foe to defeat: the boots. He had no idea what to do after that, whether he would contact the campsite's ranger, another campsite, or even the police, but at least he wouldn't be doing it in full-on rave or drag. He could stay anonymous until he found the proper facilities or people to free him from this prison. His near victory in disguising his new look was quickly stalled when sounds of his sleepy friends drifted out of their tents, the telltale sign of someone needing a bathroom break, or a "what was that noise?" scouting trip. Ted took shallow breaths as he snuck to the rear of the truck, waiting for his formerly fellow campers to go back to sleep. The sound of sleeping bags being rearranged filled the air, followed by the horrible sound of a tent zipper opening. Ted cursed and turned the flashlight off, diving down beside the truck. He stayed frozen, his heartbeat filling his ears, waiting to bolt at the first sound of movement. Moments passed, a slight cough was heard, along with a mumbled banter with the tent, ending with "I don't know" and a quick zipping of the flap. Ted froze for a number of minutes, waiting for the intrusion to fall asleep. He gritted his teeth as he sat in his confined disguise, his new clothes bulging out like crazy over the fluffy fairy outfit. He was already planning his revenge, all he needed to know was who did it and what they used to attach the durable getup. Once he was free, he would attach every piece of the silly outfit to one of these assholes, he was sure of that. They wouldn't be so lucky being able to hide at a campsite though, he would be sure to leave them somewhere public. The bar? The mall? A completely different city? Ted's fantasizing drifted away, as he lacked the imagination to develop such a scheme. He also realized that whoever had poked their head out from their tent must have been asleep by now. Ted jumped up and shone the flashlight into the box, revealing the last piece of his disguise. Slunk in the corner of the truck's box was a huge pair of rubber boots, perfect for trudging through mud, wading into a lake, or covering up big sparkly pink fur feet that you somehow managed to acquire in the middle of the night. A sigh of relief squirmed out of Ted's mouth as his fluffy feet slid snugly into the vast caverns of the boots, and a feeling of fleeting victory washed over his constricted body. The feeling was short-lived, as are all things fleeting. Only a moment after he slid his foot into the last boot, a violent and unexpected force sprang from all over his body, starting with his pants, which were quickly blown open, pieces of zipper shooting out like shrapnel. The skirt was alive with movement, and spilled over his pants, sinking its fabric into the denim and ripping it to shreds. It quickly pulled the pant legs up into its bulk, leaving his nylon legs exposed to the world. An inhuman scream would have rattled the campsite, but was temporarily put on hold as the boots suddenly felt much smaller than they did before, and Ted shot a wide-eyed gaze of horror at the fountain of pink sparkly fur pouring out from the top of the boots and splashing down the sides, coating the massive, heavy boots with a thick layer of glittery soft fluffies. The familiar grasping clamp of the boots on his feet returned. This time his fluffy feet were massive trunks of pink fur, instantly making him wanting the ones he just covered up back. Now realizing that his friends obviously had nothing to do with what was happening, Ted was filled with a new degree of terror. He quickly reached down to pull the boots from his feet before the fur could cover the whole things, but a vicious jerking force snapped through the coat, throwing his arm back to his side. Although made for harsh conditions and brutal hiking trips, the coat found it was no match for the sudden rush of fuzzy fabric shooting out from beneath its zipper. The material of his cute fuzzy tube top quickly surrounded the coat, ripping it from his arms and his shoulders, then completely covered it with its green glittery skin. A new shiver of horror made its way up his spine. Right at the same time his raver wings freed themselves from their clothed prison, his eyes were fixated at his chest, as the top began reshaping itself, and become much larger than it did before. Where his chest used to hold grapefruit-shaped mounds, it was now home to massive green furry cantaloupes. It dawned on him as much as he didn't want it to. The outfit he was trapped in was getting bigger, fuzzier, and jigglier because it was somehow eating the clothes he had thrown over top of them. Just as he was about to give up and let out a revealing cry for help to the entire campground, his head starting jerking around, a strong and somewhat angry force pulsating on his scalp. It didn't take long for his pretty pink and blue locks to snake out from under the massive towels he had wrapped around his head, and rip them from his face, bringing them deep into their soft pink and blue mass. His shocked and glittering face, once again exposed to the world, remained frozen in terror as the huge pigtails he sported wrapped themselves around the stack of towels, squeezed hard, then suddenly fluffed themselves out to a huge mound of pink and blue sparkles, something that would make even the most hardcore drag queen squirm. The hair on his head wiggled around and settled until it was frozen in its gigantic new size, and just like that, everything was still again. Unable to accept what just happened, unwilling to move from his terrified stance, he looked down at his body, greeted by the look of big fuzzy mountains wiggling around on his chest. Looking further, he could see the skirt had poofed out many times larger as well, complete with a brand new fur trim, bursting with softness and sparkles. Not a single scrap of clothing was anywhere to be seen. The fairy outfit had devoured every last bit. The icing on the cake was on the bottom this time, as his feet were stuck inside his new boots, which were a very thick, heavy, and full pair of furry boots, glittering pink, making any sort of silent walking practically impossible. He slowly raised his hands to his head, feeling the soft bubble of hair, a feeling of defeat coursing through his veins at how far it stuck out around his head. He pulled at it, and was again met with the feeling of yanking at his own scalp. He pulled harder, a lump forming in his throat, praying that it was a bad dream, and a hard enough yank would pull him back into reality. He pulled and pulled, losing his balance slightly, and stumbled across the campsite, the fur on his boots shaking and fluffing out as he did so, and his massive melon chest bouncing and thrashing around in its permanent green home. Through the grunting, the pulling, the yanking, and the stomping, he didn't hear the sound of half a dozen zippers opening up. Through tear-filled eyes surrounded by makeup refusing to run, he never saw his fellow campers forming a circle around him, giggling and laughing at this bizarre scene that had found its way into their campsite. Ted immediately saw the cell phones come out, with pictures clicking frantically. Jesus, Ted! What the hell are you wearing? Ted stared at his friends in frozen disbelief, his hands frantically moving from one piece of clothing to the next. He pulled on his new hairdo, he kicked at the boots, he pulled at the breasts. His friends had nothing to do with this, it was something beyond them. Something beyond what he'd ever understand. He ran back to the truck, huge fur boots stomping all along the way, and held his mane of hair out of the way as he rummaged around in the box. Dude, are you filming this? This is the weirdest shit I've ever seen. Ted turned to everyone, brandishing a large steak knife. Instead of attacking his friends, he tried sawing the huge mound of hair from his head. He grabbed a section and started cutting at it, but the knife simply rubbed harmlessly against the mass of pink and blue. He began to shake, his blood running cold, as he dove the knife against one of his huge breasts, only to have the gelatinous mass squish around the sharp point. Not even the sweater popped a stitch. What the hell? His friends, although still filming, became fascinated by what was going on. Ted, just take it off, man. What are you doing? It doesn't come off. Ted shrieked, demonstrating how the knife refused to penetrate the fluffy skirt floating around his thighs. Dude, you look like a fairy. One of his friends laughed, oblivious to the seriousness and permanence of Ted's appearance. Ted began to lose all signs of rational thought. Although some of his friends were stunned by what they saw, others were laughing hard. Lights were popping up in campsites all around them, with curious campers ambling their way over to their site. Ted shivered and backed against the truck, his huge behind squishing against it as he did, his breasts quivering with his short breaths. He didn't know what was going on, but he was certain it was some sort of horrible dream. A horrible dream that he had to wake up from, somehow. He closed his eyes and tried to ignore the scene he made, tried to ignore the huge hairdo he now sported, which constantly brushed and nestled against his face. The big breasts that bounced around at the slightest movement. The big wings sending glitter glints through the camp. The constant taste of sour candy coming from his lips, the mirror showing him his flawless drag queen appearance. He clenched his teeth and closed his eyes, the big false eyelashes mashing themselves together. Wake up! Ted screamed to himself, the sound of laughter drowning out everything else. Campers had a clear sight of what was making all the noise, and it instantly made it worth their while. Wake up! A girl made her way over and burst into hysterics, playing with his hair and admiring his makeup. Oh God, please, let me wake up. Another group of girls sauntered over, began posing with him, taking pictures, one girl announcing that she wanted to try his wig on. She laughed even harder as she pulled at his wig, asking him repeatedly how to take it off. Please God, let me wake up. The stunned silence as his friends drove him home the next day, his fairy outfit and hair occupying most of the back seat, everyone staring at him like he was a leper. Wake up. Through the following months, people stared at Ted everywhere he went, little girls pointing and announcing they want to be a pretty fairy, just like him. Look at his makeup, Mommy. It's perfect. Wake up. Doctors, hardware specialists, scientists of any sort. Head scratching, shoulder shrugging, and general confusion followed him everywhere he took his glittering fairy prison. Please, please. Broken knives, empty pill bottles, snapped nooses. The fluffy fairy outfit clung to him every second of every day, constantly jiggling or bouncing or swishing, reminding him of his feminine image, refusing to budge, his skin impervious to cuts, his body immune to poison, bullets bouncing from his head. Nothing worked. Even starving himself turned out to be pointless. Please. Ted never got used to the outfit. It was almost like it was trying to constantly get his attention. The hair would always fall into his face, the breasts constantly weighed heavily on his shoulders. He tried using a hair tie to tie his hair back, but it evaporated into a sparkling pink shade of eyeshadow that blended with his already overdone blue. He was terrified at what a bra might do to his already humongous chest. Walking anywhere would erupt his booty into a jiggling dance of girlishness. Wake up. A decade later, Ted still lays in bed at night, his eyes clenched shut, big fluffs of hair sticking from his head, immaculate makeup still flawless, muttering to himself, again and again, praying. Wake up. A century later. Wake.